see. The word is Greece, like the country Greece. Again, that's an extra credit word for those of you who are currently online. If you're watching the video at a later time, that's just one of the words. But if you're online right now, like Hannah or Durgan or Hunter, so on and so forth, then you'll need that's an extra credit word. So if I don't give you the extra credit, feel free to remind me that it's extra credit. All right, now, let's see. Cook is online. Kincaid is online. Burton is online. Hunter is online. Hughes is online. Hannah is online. And Durgan is online. And that's it for now. And no one else is here. And you guys can still hear me, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I had verified it earlier, but knowing my luck in technology, that was 10 minutes ago, so I had to verify it again. So it's a little late in the game for me to be telling you guys, but or giving you reminders because we really only have 1 week left. But if you're trying to join online, you need to make sure you're logged into your WVSU email account. Right now, it's not a problem because I'm not lecturing. But let's say, for example, that I wasn't paying close attention and you're trying to log on. I have to let you in if you're not in your WVSU email account. And obviously, if I'm not paying attention, because it's only a little pop-up screen that tells me that. So you run the risk of not being able to join if you don't ensure that you're signed into your WVSU email account. Anyway, Kennedy's here now. Online, that is. Who else joined us? Canterbury's online. Let's see. I think I might have everybody. Kincaid. Oh, Fisher's online. Also, as I'm looking at these and marking down who's here and who's not, I'll remind you, just because I said you're online doesn't mean you've got your points, right? You have to send those words in. I know there's at least one of you who was online on Monday, but still hasn't sent the words. So make sure you do that. Morning. So Reinhardt. Yep, Reinhardt is here in person. Madeline is here in person. Morning. Morning. Both of the Meltons are here in person. Galloway is online. I think I've got everybody. A little bit less than 2 minutes left. So I don't know if you guys are on Facebook or on the Facebook group, but I posted an announcement yesterday because I'm looking for you guys' feedback. Next week, or not next week, next semester, I'm changing the due dates for the pre-labs. They're going to be due on Friday now instead of Sunday. That way I have all weekend to say, check and make sure they did it, because, you can't come to lab if you didn't do the pre-lab. So that gives me and whoever the TA may be some time to do it. So I was thinking, should I keep the an independent work due date on Sunday, or should I move it to Friday or some other day? My thinking is if I move it to Friday, that helps because that would be the only due date every week. Everything's due on Friday, which is easier to remember. But then again, that could also be overwhelming to have so much stuff due on one day. So any input? You guys have an opinion on that? No? Okay. Yeah, I'm putting myself in the student shoes. That's what I would want. Thank you. So you guys all think about that, and if you do have an opinion later and want to share it with me, please do. All right, less than a minute left. So I'll do attendance once more. So again, if you're online and I call your name and say you're not here, you can correct me if you want, but it doesn't really matter because you'll need to send me the words afterwards anyway. So Abigail is not here. Kincaid is online. Andrea is not here. Mullins is not here. Lewis is not here. Cooper is not here. Hunter is online. Meltons are both here. Crowder is not here. Reinhardt is here. Again, both Meltons are here. Julia is not here. Talbert is not here. Kennedy is online. Hannah is online. I do remember seeing Larissa log on right before I switched the screens, so she's online. Madeline is here. Hughes is online. Galloway is online. Cook is online. Durgan's online. Spade is not here. Burton is online. Kinder is not here. Jones is not here. Canterbury is online. Hobson's not here. And Fisher is online. I think we've got everybody. All right, really quick announcements. Let me move quickly here. So I'm scheduled to get my new computer today at 9, which matters a little bit because that's when I have my office hours. So I should be in my office, but then again, so will be the person who's setting up my computer will also be in the office. So I don't know if I'm allowed to have visitors. Will I have room? I don't know. I certainly won't be online. I guess my point being is if you need me for office hours, your best bet will be to call my cell phone or call my office phone, and it'll be forwarded to my cell phone. So any questions about that? All right, then. Speaking of which, the first word for attendance will be the first official word anyway. Right there, I'm pointing at it. Since we're talking about it. Well, nah, that's a stupid line. All right, the first word is computer. Anyway, I also remind you, on Friday, we are not meeting in person. It is 100% online, office hours and lecture. Because we're having a research symposium, so they're going to be using this room anyway. So we've been kicked out of this room. So I took that opportunity. I'm going to travel because my family is from Greece. Our Easter is this Sunday. So I'm traveling to Georgia to visit my family for Easter. So on that note, because I'm traveling and because I'm having the new computer, this is just like asking for troubles, right? So be prepared. I might have to share a video with you on Friday. As a matter of fact, if I were you, unless you really want to, I wouldn't even log on Friday morning because I'm going to try. I mean, I will. I'm just saying if I were you guys, no need to wake up early and log on just to find out that it didn't work. But it's up to you. I will be there, or I will try to be there. I will try to do a lecture. But again, I will have an older video ready to go just in case there's problems. So it's got to be prepared for problems. So any questions about that? Exam 3, I still need to look at that today. There was still one person or two people who hadn't taken it on Monday. So I gave them one last chance to take it. And then yesterday I was working not in front of my computer, so I didn't have a chance to look. So today I will look, and then I'll let you guys know if you can retake it or not, because it depends on how you do as a class. So any questions about that? All right, next week there's no lab. It's a free lab, as you can see, as you've seen in the syllabus, meaning you don't have to show up. You don't have to turn anything in. For your grade, I'm going to use your highest lab grade. For almost all of you, that's a 20, because if you remember, the photosynthesis respiration lab was broken down into 2 weeks. The first week, we just showed up for the pre-lab lecture, and you got 20 points for being there. And then the second week, we actually did the lab. So for most of you, it's 20 points. Check your grade book to see what your highest score is. If it's not 20 points, and you want, obviously, the higher, if you want 20 points for next week, contact me. We can maybe figure out an old lab that you can fix to get the 20 points, or I could give you some extra credit lab to do for the 20 points, but let me know. So again, no need to come in, no need to turn anything in, nothing to do. I'll be online during lab time. Elijah should be in H205 during lab time. That way, if you want either one of us to help you with the old labs or anything else, then we'll be ready for you. So any questions about lab? Almost done with announcements. All right, final exam. That's not this coming week, obviously. I think this coming week's the last week of class. Anyway, final exam will be open the whole week. So the whole finals week, from the moment it starts to the moment it ends, the final exam will be online. 100 questions, about 100 questions. About 50 of them will be from the first 3 exams. About 50 of them will be from those last few chapters. If you want to do an exam review, let me know. Meet me online. We can do that. That also, depending on how we do the review, you might get some extra credit, right? So if we go over your old exams, for example, you'll get some extra credit. And again, to remind you, if you want more time, so you have about 100 minutes to take about you will have 100 minutes to answer about 100 questions. So if you need more time, you need to meet me online so we can, so I can ensure you're taking a closed book exam. So if I know that you're taking a closed book exam, then you will, I'll basically eliminate the time restraint. Yes, question.
For turning in the extra words every day and like other extra credit things that we've done, where does that go?
Good question. All right. Okay, great question. And someone actually emailed me a question. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm gonna answer it because I love it when you have questions, but I also want to tell you where to answer your own questions because I want you to be able to work without me. So if you ever notice, whenever I send you an email that has the word extra credit in it, it's a link. If you click that link, it tells you all that information. So, but still, I'm glad you asked. So the extra credit points, I'm compiling them off to the side. And if you've been turning in extra credit, you know that because I'll email you back and say, this is how many points you have. And that will be added at the end. But please read that document, and I'll share it again if I need to. Anytime you see that link that says extra credit, click on it and read it so you can see how the math works. It's not like I'm just throwing all those points at the end. Okay. The math is a little bit tricky.
But like per se, like attendance extra credit will be towards attendance, lab extra credit will be towards lab.
Good question. So attendance extra credit is already added to your attendance. So that is already added. Lab extra credit, those are added to your actual labs. You know what I mean? Like, so if you answer one of those extra credit questions at the bottom of the lab worksheet, that gets added to that lab. So the other stuff is the stuff I'm compiling to the side. Yeah. So great question. Yes, and that'll be added at the end. And again, you should read that document because it shows how the math works, and it says like other disclaimers, like you're not going to be able to jump up more than one letter grade. So even if you did like 1,000 extra credit points, which no one has, I'm just saying, it says right there, you can't jump 2 letter grades strictly due to extra credit, because the idea isn't for it to be a game changer. It's just to give you a little boost if you need a little boost. Great question. Anything else? I think that's it then. All right. So the next word for attendance will be time. I think that's it. If I come up with any other reminders or announcements, which I'm sure I will, I'll let you know. Anyway, let's jump back into this. We essentially finished chapter 19 on Monday, but really quickly, I did add this to the PowerPoint. I want to talk about it. So as I told you, this PowerPoint for this chapter and also the next chapter, I based those PowerPoints off of the old textbook because they were perfect the way they were. Well, not perfect, that's a strong word. I liked them the way they were, so I thought even when I went to this new textbook, I wasn't going to change it. So, as I've told you before, things are a little bit out of order. In addition to that, there's some stuff in chapter 19 that was in the textbook that was not in my lecture. So I just want to point this stuff out to you. That way, when you're reading chapter 19, I don't want you thinking, Wait a minute. Did he say that? I don't remember him saying that. Am I going to get tested on that? So I'm going to tell you right now some of the stuff that's in the textbook that was not in my lecture. Therefore, I'm not going to test you on it. So remember we talked about estimating population size and how you can't, it's not like humans where you can just do a census and count every human. You have to do these estimates. We did talk about that. What I didn't talk about was the specifics on how scientists go out and estimate population size. So when you're reading this portion of the textbook, you can completely ignore it. I'm not going to ask you about quadrates and marks and recaptures or any kind of, you can see here, there's a formula. I'm not going to ask you anything about that. I'm not going to ask you anything about species distribution patterns. I'm not going to ask you anything about demography or the mortality rate equation or even the population growth equation, right? We did talk a little bit about population growth and just talked about the basics, right? Population grows when there's more births and immigration in than there are deaths or immigration out, right? Common sense, and we're just going to leave it at that. We're not dealing with those equations. Density dependent regulation and density independent regulation. We did talk about density dependent versus density independent factors, right? But your book talks about regulation, and they're closely related. But you just go off of what I said in the lecture. Let's see. Here's some more stuff. This covered in chapter 19 in the book, the chapter 20 in the PowerPoint. Okay. Yep. So predation and herbivory, we're going to talk about coming up. Defense mechanisms, we're going to talk about that. Competitive exclusion principles, we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. Symbiosis, commensalism, mutualism, all this stuff. All that stuff you see on the screen right now in your new textbook, that was in chapter 19. But in the PowerPoints, all that stuff is going to be on this next PowerPoint that I'm about to give you. So are there any questions about chapter 19 before we start our last chapter of the semester? All right. Let's do it. Oh yeah, this stuff too. Sorry, there's still more. Part 4, foundation species. Yeah, we're not going to talk about foundation species at all. You can read about it. I might have some extra credit questions, but I'm not going to test you on that. Keystone species we'll talk about. Disturbances we'll talk about again. Primary succession and pioneer species. We'll cover that briefly in secondary succession. So all these things are going to be on the next chapter. So speaking of the next chapter, let's jump into it. Chapter 19. If you came in late, don't forget, I know you usually email me anyway for your extra credit words, but make sure you email me. In this case, not just for extra credit, but for credit. So, here we go, chapter 21. And again, this is based off of the old textbook, so it's the same information, just a slightly different order from the textbook that you guys are using. Here we go. And it's broken down into these 4 big points: biodiversity, community ecology, and you already know what, well, we'll come back to that, ecosystem ecology, and then finally conservation and restoration biology. So here we go. The loss of biodiversity is the first thing we'll talk about. And the first thing you need to know is, what is biodiversity? Does anybody know what biodiversity is? Or if you had to guess, what do you think that means? You guys are so shy or tired. All right, well, biodiversity. Basically, it's the variety of living things. That's the first thing you need to know about biodiversity. Before you start adding details into the definition, that's the first blanket statement of biodiversity, is the variety of living things. Kind of in the name, right? Bio, living, diversity, well, variety. It includes, and you need to know the difference between these things, and we're going to talk about them separately. So if you're taking notes, I guess you don't necessarily need to write them down yet. But genetic diversity is a subcategory of biodiversity. Species diversity is a subcategory of biodiversity. And ecosystem diversity is a subcategory of biodiversity. Right? So we're going to talk about all 3 of those things separately. Are there any questions so far? All right. And again, I apologize. I'm moving quick because we're still a little bit behind. And obviously, I want to get everything covered before we start, before we do the final exam. Anyway, genetic diversity, let's talk about it. We've already mentioned this briefly. That's why I have that little picture of the cheetah down there. Because when we were talking about, what was the context of that? Microevolution, yeah, the bottleneck effect, right? So we were talking about how cheetahs almost went extinct twice. And in the process of doing so, they lost their genetic diversity. So that's what we're about to talk about. And also, if you download the PowerPoint, if you click that picture of the cheetah, there's a little video you can watch. But here we go. Genetic diversity in a population. It's basically just the variation in alleles, right? So when you think about all the alleles, again, the genetics class that we had, which was, again, a very simplified version of a very complex situation. But in that situation, right, there was always that one trait that had two different versions, right? So that's what we're talking about, right? Either dimpled chin or not dimpled chin, right? Hitchhiker's thumb or not, all those things. We had the variations in the alleles. These are the raw materials that make microevolution and adaptation possible, which is why you learned about it in that context first. If a population is lost, right, then the number of individuals in the species declines. So let me remind you again what a population is. Otherwise, that will make no sense. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that are in the same place at the same time. You know, they're interbreeding, they're dealing with the same weather issues, they're competing for the same resources, right? So what that means, for example, again, I'll just use the same example to keep it consistent. The population of squirrels on WVSU's campus, right? That's a population, right? They're here, they're the same species, they're the same place at the same time, dealing with the same issues. That's different than the population of squirrels in Kanawha State Forest, for example, right? They're the same species, but it's different populations, right? They're separated from each other. So imagine if we did lose, for some reason, all the squirrels on WVSU's campus, that means we lost that entire population, right? Not the entire species, not all the squirrels worldwide, but at least that population of squirrels on our campus. So if we lose that population, obviously, we're going to lose the number of individuals of the species worldwide, but also more importantly, we're going to lose genetic resources for that species, right? Because as you lose a population, or even just an individual, if you just even lose an individual, every individual in a population, right, has contributes to the gene pool. So even if you just lose one, you're decreasing the genetic resources for that species. And that threatens the survival of the species. So to remind you, again, the same analogy I gave, or the same example I gave the first time we talked about the cheetahs and the bottleneck effect, COVID-19 is a great example from that, right? A lot of us have had it. Some of us didn't even affect us. Some of us are really sick. Some people have died from it. And it's a lot more than genetics, but some of it did have to do with genetics, right? So again, if something had happened and humans went through a bottleneck 200 years ago, and for some reason the people who were immune to COVID-19 without knowing it were the ones that died back then now we'd have been in a more serious trouble. Anyway, any questions about genetic diversity in a population? So what we're doing is looking very specific and then moving out, right? So again, we're talking about biodiversity in general. There's three subcategories. The first one we just got finished talking about is genetic diversity. That's very specific, right? We're looking at a very small subset of the population. And now we're going to kind of back up and have a bigger picture. Oh yeah, sorry, we're still talking about genetic diversity. Genetic diversity does have economic value. So this isn't, again, just like a hippie tree hugging thing, like I always like to say. It's not just like, oh, I love plants and I love animals and we should protect them all. This is actually goes back to money too, because I know some people are only motivated by money. So there you go. That brings us something called bioprospecting. I'm not going to ask you what bioprospecting is, but that is the potential development of new medicines, new industrial chemicals, and other stuff that we could use. Basically, monetizing nature. But it could also save the food supply. That's why I have those pictures of this banana. This is an example from your old textbook. There we go. So the example they give are these things called Cavendish bananas. I'm sure you've gone to the grocery store and seen, you probably noticed that all bananas are pretty much the same, right? Unlike apples, right? There's red apples, there's green apples, there's different types of red apples, there's different types of green apples, right? You go to the store, there's all kinds of different apples. When you go to the store, you're pretty much only seeing Cavendish bananas, right? Because there are some other breeds, but essentially that's the big ones, right? And here's the thing, though: they're all clones of each other. There is absolutely no genetic diversity amongst the Cavendish banana. So if there was some kind of disease that could wipe one of them out, then it could wipe all of them out, right? At least genetically speaking. Because if one of them is genetically predisposed to be killed by that pathogen, that disease, then they all would be, right? And as a matter of fact, one of them has emerged. So there is a disease that's killing off the bananas. You can look into it for independent work if you want. This is slightly old. So actually I am curious because I haven't looked into it since I've first put this up here, but that triggered a search for wild species. So that way they can look at the genome there and see if they can incorporate some genes that'll help protect it from this pathogen. But anyway, the Cavendish thing, Cavendish bananas, put a big old X through that because that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about bananas. Most likely for the exam, I'll describe some sort of biodiversity situation, and you'll need to recognize it as genetic diversity. So that would be, we're talking about that one species, right? If I'm talking about the gene pool of one species on the exam, that means I'm probably talking about genetic diversity. And that brings us to the next one, which is species diversity. Your old textbook, or maybe it was this one, I don't remember. Anyway, probably both, pointed out that humans are pushing species toward extinction, right? As a matter of fact, the present rate is 100 times higher than any time in the past 100,000 years. So, first of all, let me back up a step. Extinctions happen. That's normal. That's part of nature. Species come and species go. It'll probably happen for humans one day. Point is, it's a natural thing. However, what's happening right now is probably not necessarily natural. And even if it is, it's still not, it's not a good sign. Basically, what we're hinting at here is we might be looking at another mass extinction. You can look that up for independent work too. There's been 5 mass extinctions that we know of in the history of the Earth. And the Earth will be fine. Nature will be fine. Eventually, it'll all rebound. Everything will be okay. However, not all the species will make it. And again, as humans, that one of those species that might not make it might be us. But anyway, at the current rate of extinction, over 1/2 of all plant and animal species may be gone by the end of the century. Nothing on this slide will be on the exam. This is more like an introduction before we start talking about species diversity. It's like, hey, why is this important? This is why it's important. So now let's talk about it. Your book, the old textbook, gives some examples of some recent extinctions and things that have just recently become endangered. This is the Hector's dolphin. It is, at least when the old textbook was published, at that point, it had just become endangered. You can look that up for independent work. Is it still endangered? Is it extinct now? Has it rebounded? I really don't know. This one's a really good example. Back when the old textbook was published in 2016, I believe, I'm not positive on that, but I think this species was thought to be extinct, the Formosan clouded leopard. But since then, they have found that it is not extinct. They have found some individuals, but I like to keep it in the PowerPoint to point that out. So sometimes it's not 100% accurate. Here's some non-book examples that I looked up. And again, these are relatively recently. The West African black rhinoceros is now extinct. And at the time that I made this PowerPoint, that was the most recent species that went extinct, which is why I included it. Passenger pigeons have gone extinct, and the Carolina parakeet has gone extinct. And the only reason I included those, because they're pretty old, is because those were local. So those 2 species at the bottom used to live in West Virginia, and they no longer do. But again, these are just examples. I'm going to put it next to that. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. If you download this PowerPoint, each one of those bullet points is a little video that you can watch about those 3 species. Let's talk about some current assessments. Put a big old X through here. We're going to talk about them, but I'm not going to test you on them. Maybe, if anything, you might get an extra credit question, but probably not. About 13% of the 10,004 birds and, whoa, looks like I'm missing something there. Bird species have gone extinct. About 1/4 of the 5,488 mammals are now threatened with extinction. Over 20% of freshwater fish have become extinct during the human history, or at least seriously threatened. About 41% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. And of the about 20,000 U.S. plant species, 200 have become extinct. And then finally, over 10,000 plants worldwide are threatened with extinction. So this is old information. I'm not going to test you on it. It's just an example. Your book is just trying to point out, hey, species diversity, it's important. You know, we're losing a lot of species. I'll also point out that these are all really old numbers. So if you want a really easy independent work idea, just look it up. You know, like I was looking it up, and it turns out there are not 10,004 bird species. There are however many, right? So you could check any of those numbers and send me a 2-sentence independent work paper where you say, according to this source, These are the new numbers. But again, I'll remind you, independent work is technically past due. So I'm only grading independent work once I'm caught up grading new work. And then I go back and grade old stuff, independent work and lab corrections, things like that. So anyway, species diversity. Let me back up really quickly before we finish it. So genetic diversity was a little bit more complicated, right? Genetic diversity, we were looking at a certain population, and when you lose individuals from that population, then that hurts the genetic diversity. Species diversity, I think that's what most people think of when they think of biodiversity. That's just the number of species. Excuse me. Actually, let me see something really quickly. Yep. I might need to come back to this. Yeah, what in the world? Looks like I'm missing a slide. I am missing a slide. Anyway, so when you read the textbook about species diversity, excuse me, or maybe it's later in this chapter, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it now just in case it's not later in the chapter. There's basically two different ways we look at species diversity. And one of them is the very, very basic way is how many species are in the area, right? So if you look at right now, the species diversity in our room seems to be one, right? Because all I look around, I see humans. Now, granted, there's probably mold and bacteria. Well, there's definitely bacteria, and there's probably some nematodes, things like that. But as far as we can see, you would say the species diversity is one. Now, if we were to bring in 2 dogs and 5 cats, then we could say the species diversity in this room is 3, right? Because we have humans, dogs, and cats, right? That's species. That's one way of looking at it. Then we look at this is later in the chapter, so I'll talk about this later too. But then we have something called abundance, relative abundance. So again, we have a bunch of humans in this room. Now, if I were to bring in, I don't know, 1 snake and 1 mouse, it's still not very diverse. Yeah, we might have 3 species total, but we also have a lot more humans than we have other species. But again, that's a concept we'll come to later in the chapter. Let's talk about the last type of biodiversity, which is ecosystem diversity. And as you might imagine, that is just the variety of ecosystems on Earth, right? And really quickly, before we talk about ecosystem diversity, I guess I should explain what an ecosystem is. I'll remind you way back in chapter 1 when we're talking about, remember we talked about, what was it, atoms at one end. We said that's the very small end of what we learn about. There's no way I'm drawing that. But anyway, atoms make up molecules, and the molecules made up organelles, and organelles made up cells, and then we went all the way up, right? So to remind you, what we just finished on chapter 19 was we were talking about populations, right? And again, a population is a group of the same species in the same place at the same time. So an ecosystem is sort of like that, but now instead of looking at just the one species at the same place at the same time, we're looking at all the species. So going back to my old example, instead of just looking at the squirrels on WVSU's campus, we're looking at all the species, right? All the trees, all the cats, all the humans, dogs, mice, rats, whatever, all the bacteria, everything living would be considered the ecosystem. Not only do we talk about the living components too, but the non-living, which is what abiotic means, right? So if we're talking about an ecosystem, we don't just consider what's living in that area. We also talk about the non-living things that affect the living things, like what's the climate? You know, how much does it rain? How hot does it get? How cold does it get? How much air pollution is coming from Institute, right? How much noise pollution is coming from the interstate? Things like that. All the non-living things that affect the living things, all that stuff is considered for an ecosystem. Anyway, due to interactions amongst different species, a loss of one species could have a negative effect on the entire ecosystem. That's just what your book's pointing out. That's just an introduction to talking about ecosystem diversity. But that itself is not an ecosystem diversity. Again, if you lose one species, that would be an example of species diversity, right? But now we're talking about ecosystem diversity. Before we talk about that, we'll really quickly talk about ecosystem services. These are functions that are performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people. So once again, I'll keep saying what I've been saying. This whole discussion is not just a hippie tree-hugging thing. It's like, oh, I love nature and let's take care of nature, which I do. I'm kind of a tree hugger. But I know a lot of people only care about, money or how does this benefit me. So ecosystem services do benefit humans. We need ecosystems. Without it, we wouldn't have air. We wouldn't have clean water. And granted, we do have technology that can make us air and make us clean water, but we couldn't sustain the entire human population with that. Climate regulation, erosion control, those are just examples. You don't need to know any of them. You can look them up if you want. There's a whole lot more of them. You can look them up for independent work, but basically, what are the ecosystem services? Forests absorb and store carbon. That's another example from your book. Coral reefs provide food, storm protection, and recreation. A great example, especially for me, like I've said before, I'm from the South. So for me, coral reefs, or for my family and such, that provides, that's their coal mining, right? That's the industry. That's the tourism industry, amongst the other stuff that's listed there. But anyway, you can look that up for independent work if you want. I think the best example, other than air, would be pollination, right? We need insects to pollinate our crops. So without things like bees, for example, we'd be dead, right? So we need ecosystem services for survival. These are just some examples from your old textbook. Again, with these numbers, I'm not going to get specific. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but it is a good example. Coral reefs are rich in species diversity, yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans. And again, this is from the old textbook, so that's another good independent work topic. I bet that number's changed. There's probably a lot more that have been destroyed by humans at this point. Same here. Back when this was published, about 75% of the coral reefs on Earth have been threatened, and that was expected to top 90% by 2030 if the current abuses continue. So once again, that is old information. Feel free to look it up for independent work. The next word for attendance will be coral, since we're talking about it. Any questions about this example of how ecosystem diversity is important? Actually, the book so far hasn't even really gotten this. Talked about why species are important, why ecosystems are important. But we haven't even quite gotten to what ecosystem diversity is yet. I didn't even put it on the slide. All right. So basically, again, what's not written on the screen here is, think about it. Genetic diversity is looking at one population and talking about all the gene pool, right? The individuals in that population. Then we took it back a step and talked about species diversity, which is all the different species living on Earth, right? So if you lose one species, that messes with species diversity. Now we're talking about ecosystem diversity, which is looking at all the different types of ecosystems. Right? So even in this area, we have a lot of different ecosystems, right? So you could look across the road and we have like a forest ecosystem. Here we have an urban ecosystem, right? Where there is some greenery, but it's planted and maintained by humans. And then on the other side of the campus, we have a river ecosystem, right? So these are all different ecosystems. And just like species diversity or genetic diversity, we need all these different ecosystems doing all these different functions, doing all these different ecosystem services for things to work for us, for our very survival. So it is important. Now, I'm not going to be one of those people who says, if you don't quit using straws, the world's going to die in 15 years, right? I hate making predictions. But I will say this is a matter of life and death, whether it be in 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years. These are things we have to consider, because eventually we will all die off if we don't fix what we're doing. Anyways, on that note, let's talk about causes of declining biodiversity. You need to know these four. We're going to talk about them separately. The first one we're going to talk about is habitat destruction and fragmentation, followed by invasive species. Again, we've talked about that in the last chapter. We're going to talk about it again. And we'll talk about overexploitation, and then we'll talk about pollution. And overall, no matter which four we're to talk about, it all boils down to one thing, which is the expanding size and dominance of human population, right? So the root cause of habitat destruction and invasive species and overexploitation and pollution, it's all humans, right? We are causing all those things. So let's take a look here. First one we're talking about is habitat destruction. And the reason we talk about that one first is because it is the most powerful, right? It is the greatest threat to biodiversity, and you definitely need to know that. Habitat destruction and fragmentation is the greatest threat to biodiversity, which for me is kind of easy to remember. Because if we back it up and look at the slide we looked at earlier, if we have invasive species, that's going to mess up the habitat. If you have overexploitation, which is like when you cut down too many trees or harvest too many fish or whatever, we'll talk about that later, that will destroy the habitat. If we have pollution, that destroys the habitat, right? So all of these other things lead to habitat destruction. So hopefully that'll help you remember that habitat destruction is the greatest threat to biodiversity, and you need to know that. Some examples that your book gave are agriculture, urban development, forestry, mining, all those things. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the examples, but basically things we need to live, right? So I'm not sitting here saying, all right, we need to protect the environment at all costs, and we need to stop all these things. Like, we can't, right? We have to have agriculture to eat. We have to have urban development for a place to live. We need forestry, again, for a place to live, to build our homes. We need mining, right? We can't, without mines, we don't have electricity, whether you're talking about coal mines or lithium mines, right? So when you're using renewable energy, either way, you've got to mine something. Anyway, another example, this last bullet point, I'm not going to get this specific for the exam, but habitat destruction and fragmentation affects over 85% of birds, mammals, and amphibians, right? They are threatened with extinction, over 85% due to all this. There's some great extra credit videos. Speaking of that document that I talked about earlier, if you click that document, the link to take you to that document, there's another link in that document that takes you to all the videos you can watch for extra credit, and there's some great videos on this subject, and you might consider watching them for some extra credit. Anyway, any questions about this slide? That's obviously not that you need to know, but that's a picture of some strip mining, or not strip mining, strip mining, mountaintop removal. Just one example of habitat destruction. All right, next thing we're talking about is invasive species, which we talked about earlier in the last chapter, so we can go through this very quickly. That is the second greatest threat to biodiversity, so you should know that. First is habitat destruction, second is invasive species. And as you already know from the last chapter, invasive species compete with native species. They're obviously not from there. They compete with native species, right? Meaning they either compete for, I don't know, resources like food or water or sun, or maybe they compete as in like who can put out the most seeds, or who can put out seeds earlier, like we talked about in the last chapter. Sometimes invasive species, instead of competing with native species, will prey upon native species, right? So this first bullet point, that the example from the last chapter was cheatgrass, right? It competed with native species. The second bullet point, one of the examples we used was the pythons, right? Some people let pythons loose in the Everglades, and they're preying upon the native species. And then, of course, there could also be parasites, in which case the invasive species would parasitize the native species. So any questions about invasive species? There's a good example. You can look this up too. Maybe I'll try to share it with you, at least on Facebook. I don't know if I told you guys this before or not, but I went to Guam once. It's a tropical island. I was really excited to get there. But I was also like 20 years old or something, so I didn't know much about it. Definitely didn't know anything about biology. Anyway, I get there, and it's a beautiful tropical island, and there was no birds, and I always thought that was weird. And then later, once I started getting into biology, I read into it, and it turns out the reason there's no birds on Guam is because back in World War II, snakes would hitch a ride on the airplanes. You know, the airplanes were going from island to island. So some snakes left one island where they were native, and then they made it to Guam where there were no snakes. So none of the species, the birds or anything, were evolved to avoid snakes. Right? So these snakes that hop a plane from another island, they killed all the birds on Guam. And the other interesting thing is too, now I think, the way they're combating them, or the way they did combat them, was they would take dead mice and they would lace them with Tylenol and put little parachutes on them and drop them out of airplanes and helicopters. So it was just like dead mice floating to the ground, and that's how they fed the snakes. And it would kill the snakes because they have a Tylenol overdose. Anyway, you can look into it if you want. I find invasive species really fascinating. Horrible, but fascinating. Overexploitation. That can be from harvesting at rates that exceed the ability of a population to rebound, right? So if you're, again, to remind you of one of the topics we talked about in the last chapter, if we're looking at a population growth model, you know, it kind of does exponential growth at first, then it kind of evens out. And that point where it evens out is carrying capacity. And then I told you the sweet spot where the population is growing the quickest is right there in the middle, between 0 and the carrying capacity, right? So going back to this first bullet point, if you're taking too many, right, then you're not hitting that sweet spot. And eventually, if you're catching more fish, for example, that are being born, eventually you're going to run out of fish. It's pretty common sense, right? If you're cutting down trees quicker than they can grow, eventually you're going to run out of trees, so on and so forth. Excessive commercial harvesting, poaching, and sport hunting have greatly affected populations of tigers, American bison, Galapagos tortoises, amongst others. Those are just examples. I'm not going to ask any questions specifically about those examples. But it's not just animals, too. Overexploitation also threatens trees like mahogany and rosewood and things like that. Again, those are just examples. The point is, when you're collecting something quicker than it can replace itself, that is overexploitation. And for common sense reasons, that's not, it's not a good thing. So any questions about overexploitation? All right, pollution is the last one we'll talk about when we talk about causes of declining biodiversity. This one's also really common sense, so we can just kind of slide right through this. What is pollution? It's bad stuff, right? Your book only talks about, if I remember correctly, only talks about air and water pollution, but there's all kinds of there's noise pollution, there's light pollution, but we're sticking with the big ones. Air and water pollution are a contributing factor in the declining populations of a lot of species. The global water cycle transport pollutants from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems hundreds of miles away. And this is a great example. I'm not going to test you on it, but this is a really good example for us in West Virginia. Because think about it, if you are driving down I-64 and you just throw some trash out the window, and then we have a good rain, that trash is going to probably make its way down to the Kanawha River, and then it's going to hit the Ohio River, then it's going to hit the Mississippi River, then it's going to hit the Gulf of Mexico, right? So here, little old you throwing out your Tudor's biscuit wrapper in Nitro, West Virginia, you might be polluting the Gulf of Mexico, because that's the way the global water cycle works. And that's just the water, right? Pollutants in the atmosphere are carried for thousands of miles, right? And that's also a good example. And again, just an example, so I'll put an X through here. That's a really good example for me, again, talking about this relationship between the fact that I'm from Florida or from the South, but I live in West Virginia now. A great example of this, I did this as a research project as an undergraduate. When you burn coal, one of the things that's released in the atmosphere is mercury. So what they found is there's a lot of mercury being found in the Everglades, and it's coming from coal, burning coal, right? So this thing that's helping our economy in West Virginia, which is burning coal, is then hurting the economy from where I'm from, because their economy is based on tourism. And if you're poisoning everything and everything's dying, then you're messing up the economy. So it's, again, for me, it's a great balance to look at how one industry is destroying another. And then you have these two groups of people who are completely far apart from each other and don't realize how they're affecting each other or being affected by each other. Anyway, any questions about pollution? Pretty simple. Let's talk about community ecology. Got 10 minutes left. Community will be the next word for attendance. And it's interesting that the textbook did it in this order. Now that I think about it, I kind of want to go in there and change the order. Because remember, first we talked about a population, which is just a group of one species, right? Then the last thing we talked about was an ecosystem, which I said isn't just one ecosystem or one species. It's considering all the different species living together and interacting with each other, preying on each other, competing for the same resources, whatever. And it also includes the abiotic factors, right? What is the weather? How much sunlight does it get? How much noise pollution? All those things. Now we're kind of talking about this middle thing. So in between a population and an ecosystem is this. It's a community. It is the assemblage of a species living close enough together for potential interaction. So again, in other words, it's a population, except instead of looking at one species, we're looking at all the living things, right? So if we were looking at the population in this room, we'd be, maybe studying the human population. If we wanted to look at the community in this room, we would look at obviously the humans and all the bacteria that's living in your gut, probably a little bit of mold in the air. I shouldn't say probably, maybe a little bit of mold in the air because of the flood we just had. But yeah, that's what a community is. You need to know the difference between a population and a community and an ecosystem. This picture's from the old textbook. It's a great example of a community, right? So here you have, and you can see the interactions, right? The zebra, which is a living thing, was eating this grass, which is a living thing. And when it defecated, it fertilized the grass, right? So there's a little bit of a circle of life. Then you have this lion that's eating the zebra, right? And then again, when it defecates, it fertilizes the grass. But that lion that's competing against the hyenas and the vultures, right? They're competing for the same resource. Meanwhile, all those things die, and when they die, they're going to decompose, and that's going to help the grass, right? So it's a great example. of a community. You can imagine all of the different ways they're interacting. And those are just the things we see, right? We don't see all the insects flying around or living underground or any of the bacteria or anything like that. Anyway, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. If we're talking about community ecology, the first thing we're talking about is interspecific interactions. Actually, this isn't that complicated. You probably learned about this at least in high school, maybe even in middle school. So all the different types of interactions within a community. So again, this thing eating this, and we're about to talk about this, but that would be predation, right? The lion eating the zebra. The zebra eating the grass would be herbivory, right? All these things that we're about to talk about. So interspecific interactions, you need to know what they are. They are interactions between species. So if you remember in the last chapter, I gave you an example of intraspecific interactions, which is when individuals of the same species are interacting and competing against each other. Interspecific interaction is, again, interactions between different species. Just like an interstate takes you between different states, like you can see in this picture here, that map of the eastern part of the United States, and it shows I-64. And I-64 will be the next word for attendance. Yeah, it's classified according to its effects on the population concerned. So here we go. This is just an introduction to all the different types of interspecific interactions you're going to need to know. Most likely, I might even ask you the definition of the interspecific interactions. Most likely, and I'll come back to this slide, most likely I'm going to give you an example of one of these things: competition, mutualism, predation, blah, blah, blah. I'll give you an example, and you need to recognize it as one of those things. That's most likely how the exam's going to go. But the classifications of the interspecific interactions are as follows. This is the basic. Then we get more specific, as I showed you just a couple seconds ago. It's either negative-negative, positive-positive, or positive-negative, right? So obviously negative-negative is bad for everybody involved. Positive-positive is good for everyone involved, and positive-negative is good for one, bad for the other, right? So, yeah, let's talk about it. Interspecific competition. Again, it is the competition between species, different species. Population growth is limited by this. It's also limited by the population density of competing species. So zebras and gazelles, for example, they use a lot of the same resources. They live in the same area, they eat the same things, they drink from the same watering holes, they're getting chased by the same predators, right? So because they're competing with each other, the population density of the zebra versus the gazelle will make a difference. And of course, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, if you're looking at your own population, that would be intraspecific competition as opposed to interspecific. So what determines if a population will compete? Let's talk about that. First of all, you need to know what an ecological niche is, or niche. You can pronounce it either way. If you watch any videos of any of this stuff, you'll hear it said both ways. That is an organism's total use of biotic and abiotic resources. So you could almost think of it as their job. What is their job? If we're talking about a plant and we're looking at different species of plants and talking about their ecological niche, we would say, okay, this one likes the pH of blah, blah, blah in the soil. This one prefers this pH. This one does great at this temperature. This one does better at that temperature. This one likes a lot of water. This one only likes a little water. This one needs full sunlight. This one only needs a little bit of sunlight, right? So what I'm describing there is the ecological niche, right? And I'm sure, and again, I'm just using trees or plants as an example. I'm sure you've seen and noticed plants grow in all kinds of different places, right? You can't put a palm tree in Alaska, and you probably can't put some sort of spruce tree from Alaska and put it in the Sahara Desert, right? So those are just examples. The book example is barnacles. This is from the old textbook, and I think the new textbook might even use the same example. I will put it next to this, only to remind you that I won't be asking any specific questions about these barnacles. But the niches of these barnacles, so we're looking at one genus, right? So we're looking at one spot, and we're looking at these barnacles. They're in the same genus, right? So that means they're closely related, but they're different species, right? And they compete. They live on rocks, right? So if you go to the coast, wherever they're from, they're living on the rocks, right where the ocean meets the rocks. So they compete for space. They feed from the stuff that's in the water, right? They filter feed, so they're competing for food. but they have different climatic conditions, right? So, you know, again, I use plants as an example, but this time we're using barnacles, right? What temperature does this species prefer? What temperature does that species prefer? How much humidity does this species prefer? How much humidity does the other species prefer? These are all their niches. Anyway, let's just show you, a bit easier to show you. So here it is. When both of the species are there, and again, these are just examples, you don't need to memorize those names. You can see they're both kind of, they're there, but they're separate, right? So if you were to look at this top picture, you would say to yourself, well, the brown one obviously does not do a good job in the water, right? The brown one likes to be a little bit out of the water, kind of closer to the high tide level. The blue one, on the other hand, does great in the water, but that would be an incorrect assumption. Someone did an experiment. What they did was they came in, they took all these blue ones out, and what happened once they took the blue ones out was the brown ones took over. So here at the top, it isn't that the brown ones didn't want to be there. It's not like that was outside of their niche. It's just that they were outcompeted. So they were limited to only the top part of the rock. So once you took out their competing species, then the brown species just took over. So that's just a great example of interspecific competition, an ecological niche, right? So they have, both of those species have an ecological niche that overlaps. And because of that, they are competing with each other. Which brings us to something called the competitive exclusion principle. You need to know what this is. If two species have an ecological niche that's too similar, they cannot coexist in the same place. So the example we just talked about with the barnacles is a great example of the competitive exclusion principle. Now to you, that might be the same place. You look at them, like there's a rock next to the water. Both of those species are on that rock. But when you look at it, right, even though they're on the same rock, they're not at the same place, right? They've segregated each other because of the competitive exclusion principle. The book example of this are these two different species of paramecium. Not that you need to know what a paramecium is, but they're little single-celled organisms. So what happens is they grew these two species in little petri dishes separately, right? Not with each other. They kept them in two different containers. And you can see the population growth rate for both of them, right? The different species, one of them has a red line, one of them has a blue line. And you can see both are logistic growth patterns, right? They start off exponential, and here we go, they've all leveled off at their carrying capacity, whatever that may be, because they're separate from each other. However, when you put them in the same culture, in the same area, growing them at the same time, then they're competing against each other. In this case, the red species outcompeted the blue one, right? I mean, I really quickly say this too, because your book doesn't do a great job of pointing this out. But this is another reason why biodiversity is so important. Because here we have one species that's essentially gone extinct because the other one outcompeted it. But what happens in nature is, you know, these things, well, maybe not paramecium, excuse me, but in nature, when this happens, when one species starts outcompeting the other, like imagine there's got to be something that eats both of these species. So right here, once the red species started outcompeting the blue one, the red species is going to be eaten and killed more than the blue species, right? That's common sense because there's more around there to kill. So that's what keeps it. So in real life, those lines would kind of interweave with each other because as one outcompetes the other, then it starts getting killed off and lets the other one catch up. And then the other one outcompetes the other, and then it starts getting killed off, and the cycle continues. Anyway, any questions about that? Okay, let's talk about mutualism. This one's very simple. We can go through this very quickly. There's not much to say about, oh shoot, it's 8:51. I'm sorry, guys. We're done for the day. That's it. I will see you in person on Monday, but I'll be online on Friday. Knock on wood.
I'll make some corrections to the lab.
Good question. Great question. If you make any corrections to a lab, make sure you comment somewhere on the lab. Like reply to one of our comments. Because then we'll automatically get an email that says, hey, someone's commented on this, and then I can click a link and it takes me to the lab. That's the best way to do it.